So welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for today's webinar, sharing key aspects of the Trees 3.0 draft for public comment, which was recently released by the Architecture for RED Plus Transactions, or ART. My name is Michaela Weiss. I'm a Senior Manager for Stakeholder Engagement with the ART Secretariat, and I'm excited to walk you through the proposed new draft of the standard today and explain a bit more the process for submitting public comments. So before we dive into it, just a few logistical points. You can submit questions at any time using the Q&A box located in the bottom of your webinar screen, and we will address questions at the end of the presentation. This webinar is also being recorded and will be made available along with the slides on our website, www.artred.org, on the Trees 3.0 page. You can also find the full draft of Trees 3.0 and the summary of changes on that page. So for those that may be less familiar with ART, I'd like to start with just a brief background. ART is a global carbon crediting program that is designed to issue high quality jurisdictional RED Plus credits. ART is governed and managed by an independent board of directors and the ART Secretariat, and we aim to attract finance at scale while ensuring environmental and social integrity by certifying results that can be monetized in the voluntary or compliance carbon markets or be used as the basis for results-based payments. So our vision is simple but ambitious. We want to build confidence needed in the integrity of forest emissions reductions and removals so that large-scale investments can flow into efforts to protect and restore forests and reward those who deliver those results. ART's requirements are all laid out in our standard, the RED Plus Environmental Excellence Standard, or TREES. TREES specifies the requirements that jurisdictions must follow in order to be issued credits, including requirements around eligibility, carbon accounting, safeguards, double counting, and much more. TREES also stipulates that ART must review the standard at a minimum of every 3 years in order to account for changing best practices, emerging science and technologies, and experience in implementing the standard. And we are excited to be revising TREES now that we have jurisdictions at all stages of the ART process. There are currently 26 jurisdictions that are participating in ART that cover a combined total of 442 million hectares of forest. And this TREES reviews process provides us an opportunity to refine the standard based on the experiences of the ART team, the participating jurisdictions, and the many other involved stakeholders. So the process we followed to review TREES is as follows. First, we engaged in targeted dialogues with stakeholders to better understand their experiences and perspectives on the standard, which I'll talk about more in just a minute. The ART Secretariat then worked with the ART Board to identify elements of TREES to update and iterated on a draft. We just published a board-approved draft for public comment, and we are now in step 5 on gathering feedback on the draft through the public comment period. After that public comment period ends, the Secretariat and the board will carefully review all inputs received, decide if and how to modify the draft, and publish a final board-approved TREES 3.0 along with accompanying templates and guidance materials. The board may also choose to have a second public comment period, depending on the nature of any changes that the board may decide to make based on the comments received. So the Secretariat was fortunate to have support in developing TREES 3.0 from 2 committees and an advisory group. Last year, ART and the Indigenous Peoples and Local Communities organizations Anekap, Koyabi, Redmokaf, and Repaliak formed an IPLC advisory group to support the review of TREES that was made up of those 4 organizations and 2 Indigenous leaders serving in a personal capacity. The IPLC advisory group reviewed inputs from other stakeholders and provided their reflections, insights, and ideas as part of the revision process. The advisory group will also work with ART after public comments are received to recommend any changes and to provide inputs on useful guidance materials. ART also convened 2 expert technical committees as part of the TREES review, one on removals from remaining forests, and one on the use of biomass flux data, which we'll talk about more at the end of this presentation. So, as I noted, the first step we took in the process was to engage with various stakeholders through targeted dialogues. The IPLC advisory group worked with ART to design and organize 3 in person, multi day dialogues directly with Indigenous peoples and local communities. These were held in the second half of 2024 and included a total of 84 representatives of IPLC organizations from 20 different countries. In addition, the Art Secretariat met with 29 governments, NGOs, civil society organizations, and technical service providers to better understand their experiences using trees and their feedback on how it could be improved. We also received written inputs from a number of stakeholders. So now that you understand the process for the review and revision, let's dive into some of the details. I'm going to focus the presentation on the most significant proposed changes from Trees 2.0, so I am assuming some understanding of the core elements of the current version of Trees. Just as a reminder, you can find the full summary of changes as well as the complete draft of Trees 3.0 on the ART website, as well as the current version of the standard. So let's start in the beginning. In section 2, the ART cycle, there are a number of proposed updates in the draft. First, the draft proposes a requirement that the trees registration document and trees monitoring report be submitted in any official language of the participant in addition to English. This is meant to ensure greater accessibility of the information in the participant's country. Second, the draft proposes a requirement that the trees registration document be submitted within 2 calendar years of the acceptance of the trees concept. The trees concept determines the earliest date of crediting for the participant, but there's currently no limit in trees on the time between the trees concept and the trees registration document. This new requirement would ensure the appropriateness of that initial crediting period. And third, the draft proposes lengthening the public comment period on participant documents from 30 days to 60 days and explicitly requires the participant to notify stakeholders in line with their safeguards processes in order to make the public comment process more inclusive and accessible. In section 3 on eligibility, applicable, and key requirements, the draft proposes extending the period for subnational accounting through December 31st of 2040. Currently, subnational accounting, whether that's by a national government or a subnational government such as a state or province, is only permitted until the end of 2030. Extending this timeframe continues to incentivize action at the subnational level, including in Indigenous territories, as a step towards national accounting. Second, the draft proposes including an explicit requirement that participants describe their benefit sharing arrangements and how those arrangements conform with relevant safeguards. Benefit sharing arrangements are part of Trees 2.0 and have always needed to meet our safeguards requirements. But in response to stakeholder feedback, we are proposing a new specific section in the standard for this important element. Third, the draft proposes a time-bound transition pathway for countries participating in the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility, FCPF, in the Carbon Fund or the Readiness Fund, both of which have or will sunset in the coming years. The proposed transition pathway will only apply to Carbon Fund and Readiness Fund participants who submit a trees concept and have it accepted as complete by the Art Secretariat by the end of 2028. Carbon Fund participants would be permitted to use their FCPF accounting area for 1 crediting period before needing to transition to the Readiness Fund or trees requirements for the subsequent crediting period. Readiness Fund participants would be permitted to use a subnational accounting area with at least 1 million hectares of forest rather than the trees requirement of 2.5 million hectares of forest for 2 crediting periods. And this proposed transition pathway is to enable FCPF jurisdictions to build on the work conducted with the World Bank as the FCPF program sunsets. Let's move now to section 4 on carbon accounting. The draft clarifies the requirements for emissions activity data. The requirements have not changed, but we reorganized this section and added additional information since we receive a lot of questions on this section. We also provided some additional references on good practices. Second, the draft separates and clarifies the requirements for removals activity data. Questions on quantifying removals are also common on the current version of trees, so we wanted to ensure better clarity by incorporating much of the guidance document that we developed into trees directly. And third, the draft allows emissions from peat to be calculated using IPCC Tier 1 methods if peat emissions are less than 3% of the total and peatlands have a deforestation rate of less than half of the deforestation rate in the full accounting area. ART has received stakeholder input around the challenges in the current requirements to use Tier 2 and 3 methods for peat emissions, particularly in cases where those emissions are very small. In Section 5, crediting level, the majority of the proposed changes are related to the removals crediting approach. First, the draft allows jurisdictions that qualify as high forest, low deforestation to claim removals if their emissions are within 15% of the tree's crediting level, which is the 5-year historical average. Currently, the standard only allows jurisdictions to claim removals in years where their emissions are below the tree's crediting level, but we recognize that in jurisdictions that have already achieved low emissions, this continuous decrease may not be possible. Second, the draft proposes revised definitions of commercial forest and natural forest restoration in response to stakeholder feedback that changes were needed in order to reduce confusion about which restoration activities were included in each category. And finally, the draft proposes a requirement that any commercial forests exclude invasive alien species in order to be eligible for crediting. In Section 7, on reversals and leakage, the draft proposes a requirement that participants with a reversal contribute 30% of their credits to the buffer pool for 5 years following the reversal. This was already the likely outcome, as participants would have had difficulty demonstrating the mitigating factors were effective if a reversal had occurred. However, we wanted to have this specified within the standard in order to increase transparency and streamline the reporting and verification processes. Second, the draft proposes clarifying the requirements for participants that enter ART with a reversal reported as part of their initial monitoring report. This clarification was already published as a standalone document on the ART website, but now it is included within the standard itself. In Section 8 on uncertainty, the draft proposes a requirement that uncertainty be assessed separately for emissions reductions and removals rather than together. This aligns with the changes throughout trees to calculate reductions and removals separately and recognizes the fact that emission reductions and removals may have different levels of uncertainty. In Section 10, on calculation of emission reductions and removals, the draft proposes several changes to streamline and clarify the equations. First, the draft proposes simplifying the removals equations to be clearer. Again, we hope that this will enable participants to more easily understand the requirements. Second, as recommended by numerous stakeholders, the draft proposes separating all equations for emissions reductions and removals, which are reported separately on the ART registry. This change eliminates the confusion of having a single set of equations in trees, while the subtotals are verified separately for labeling in the registry. The draft also proposes including deductions for emissions reductions and removals from other initiatives, or for which the participant does not have the rights, explicitly in the equations. These were already required to be deducted from the tree's credit volumes, but were not included in the equations in Section 10 in the current version. This change is also consistent with the guidance that ART published earlier this year on that topic. And finally, the draft proposes applying the buffer pool contribution after all other deductions have already been made. This ensures that any reversal compensation from the buffer pool is done with credits that represent actual results for which the participant has the rights. In Section 12 on environmental, social, and governance safeguards, The draft proposes combining the structure and process indicators into a single structure and process indicator for each theme. By reducing repetition and consolidating related information, it will be easier for participants to document their programs and results. And this change will also make the documents easier to navigate for stakeholders, enabling them to find information more easily, better understand how the Red Plus program is designed and implemented, and provide meaningful feedback if they desire during the public comment period. The draft also proposes a change in the timeline and form of reporting the outcome indicators. So currently, TREES 2.0 requires that at the beginning of the first crediting period, participants must either demonstrate conformance with the outcome indicators or present a plan for achieving conformance with the outcome indicators by the end of 5 years from the time the participant joined ART. This requirement was often misunderstood and incorrectly interpreted to mean that trees did not require any outcome reporting for 5 years. In TREES 3.0, we've removed this wording to prevent confusion and explained the expected reporting on the outcome indicators, as well as the structure and process indicators in the TREES registration document and the TREES monitoring report. Third, the draft proposes revised descriptions of each indicator to simplify the language and improve consistency. The draft also moves a key overarching requirement regarding safeguard implementation in accordance with ratified relevant international conventions and agreements and anchored in domestic legal frameworks, policies, or processes to the beginning of the safeguard section rather than include it in each indicator. This change also helps simplify the indicators. Fourth, the draft proposes including women, youth, and vulnerable groups in the themes related to full and effective participation and the enhancement of social benefits. While these groups were always implicitly included in the tree's safeguards, this is now explicit in the standard. The draft also proposes referring to Indigenous peoples, local communities, and Afro-descendant peoples in places that currently refer to Indigenous peoples and local communities. Furthermore, it proposes including transhumant communities and uncontacted peoples explicitly in the standard and key safeguard themes, such as the themes related to identifying Indigenous peoples, local communities, and Afro-descendant peoples, respecting their rights, and respecting and protecting traditional knowledge and practices. And finally, the draft proposes clarifying which themes relate to the distribution of benefits to address a common question on the current standard and make it explicit that participants should report on how they respected the Cancun safeguards throughout the design and implementation of their benefit distribution arrangements. In section 13 on avoiding double counting, the draft proposes clarifying the requirements for deducting verified emission reductions and removals from other CO2 equivalent-based initiatives, including carbon credit projects or results-based payments from the tree's credit volume. This is consistent with guidance that ART published on this topic earlier this year. Second, the draft proposes specifying that variances may be submitted for these requirements to address a question that ART has commonly received. And third, the draft proposes clarifying the requirements for corresponding adjustments, including the latest guidance from the UNFCCC. These are also further clarified in Annex B on requirements for avoiding double counting with ICAO's CORSIA. The draft proposes some significant changes to Section 16 on the complaints and appeals process based on our experience and on stakeholder input. It's important to ART that complaints be addressed in systems that can properly investigate and offer recourse if appropriate. The draft clarifies that the complaint and appeals process in trees is meant to handle instances where ART has not followed its practices. The draft outlines how other types of complaints can be best addressed. So for example, complaints about a participant's Red Plus program should use the appropriate dispute resolution mechanism in the jurisdiction as required by the tree's safeguards. If the complainant feels that mechanism is not effective, then that should be reported to the VVB, and it would be part of the VVB's process to determine conformance with the tree's safeguards. Complaints about the conduct or decisions of the VVB, the Validation and Verification Body, should be reported directly to the VVB through their complaint process, or can be brought to ART, who will address it through our VVB oversight process or submit it to the VVB's complaint process. The draft also proposes changing the complaints and appeals approach to create a list of potential reviewers or investigators that are not part of ART or of WinRock. If a complaint is submitted, an appropriate individual will be selected from that list based on availability and the nature of the complaint. The draft also provides revised eligibility criteria and submission process for a complaint or an appeal. These changes were based on stakeholder inputs as well as a review of similar programs processes. And finally, the draft updates the steps and timelines for the review process. So as I mentioned earlier, ART also convened 2 expert technical committees as part of the trees review process. The Forest Remaining Forest Committee explored options for incorporating removals from remaining forests into trees. For example, removals resulting from the restoration of degraded forests. The committee noted a number of remaining questions about ensuring additionality and the feasibility of quantifying removals within forests at the jurisdictional scale. So as a result, the ART board has decided not to include removals from remaining forests within the standard at this time. The second committee discussed the readiness of biomass flux data or direct estimation of biomass change from satellite or airborne sensors for the inclusion in trees. There are still a number of remaining questions about how such data would comply with other existing trees requirements and scale to the jurisdictional level. So as a result, the ART board has decided not to allow biomass flux data in trees at this time. However, biomass maps from satellite or airborne sensors can still be used to derive emission or removal factors, and this has been made more explicit within the proposed draft. So that concludes the summary of the most substantial changes in the draft of Trees 3.0. I encourage you to read the full summary of changes and the draft Trees 3.0, since I only had time to briefly touch on all of these topics today. ART really encourages all stakeholders to review the revised standard and to provide feedback. So you could hopefully sense throughout the presentation, we take stakeholder input very seriously and appreciate inputs from all our stakeholder groups to help us have the best standard possible. You can visit our website, artred.org, to access the documents, which are available in English, Spanish, Portuguese, and French. Comments will be accepted until September 22nd of 2025 and will be accepted in any language. To submit comments, you can send an email to red@winrock.org with the subject line comments on Trees 3.0 draft. And in the body of the email, please write the section number or title and the requirement of the standard that's being referenced, as well as your comment, suggestion, or other feedback. So thank you for participating in today's webinar. We will now start responding to questions that we've received through the Q&A box during this session. And it's not too late to submit any remaining questions. And if you have any questions that come up after the webinar, please also feel free to email us at red@winrock.org, and we will get back to you as soon as possible. Thank you.